joined now by the Labour MP and former Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Shabana Mahmood, by the Conservative MP, John Penrose. He's a member of the European Research Group. And also by the Liberal Democrats Treasury spokesperson, Baroness Kramer. Also here, Stuart Hosey, the SNP's trade spokesperson. Welcome to you all. So, Shabana Mahmood, what do you reckon? Did we see the beginning of the end of austerity?
No, I don't think we did. I think the rhetoric did not match the reality, and that's what we're hearing overnight and into this morning and later on today as people get to grips with the numbers.
What's the giveaway budget?
What exactly the Chancellor has announced. Well, he found more money for potholes than he did for schools. If you look at the scale of the crisis in our public services, whether that's on prisons, whether that's on policing, for which there was no more money for day-to-day policing whatsoever, given the scale of the crisis, frankly, to describe it as some sort of overly generous giveaway budget, I think is a real kick in the teeth for people who rely on our public services, which have really suffered.
John Penrose, what do you say to that?
I'd say that the Labour Party were almost bound to say that, weren't they? I mean, this is clearly a huge increase in public spending and in public investment, but it's also trying to make sure that we don't lose sight of the need for discipline as well. You can't just turn on the taps and splurge willy-nilly. You've got to make sure that you are, not just forgetting the importance that you can't live beyond your means as well. So it's trying to strike that balance, but it is a big change.
But you thought it was
it's a pretty big change. It's a pretty big change, yeah.
Stuart Hosey.
The numbers were indicative. That's what the Chancellor told us, because they all ignored the elephant in the room, which was Brexit. I mean, if you look at what the OBR said and what's in the Red Book, they're using an assumption, a broad brush assumption from 2016, and they're specific, they're explicit about this. They have postponed the point where imports and export shocks will be factored in because of the transition period. So, as with every budget I've ever seen, there are certain things to be welcomed. Of course there are. But if anyone believes the basis of these numbers and we're going to get the kind of deal that supports them, then I think they're kidding themselves on.
But, the basic decision to spend any money there was, rather than to put it towards getting rid of the deficit on time, do you welcome that?
Well, it's a sticking plaster, isn't it? And sometimes you get some benefits from a sticking plaster, but, you're not going to deal with austerity until you get growth back in the economy. And there's been amazingly little attention paid to the growth numbers. I mean, they are appalling.
Well, I did ask the Chancellor about them.
They are, well, they are, you and I both know, and so does everyone here, that they are absolutely appalling numbers, and they presume that the uncertainties of Brexit will have no impact on the economy. Now, until we deal with that, we can't actually end austerity. And I suppose what I was upset by is that rather than focusing on the people who are the most hurt, I mean, the people absolutely the poorest at the bottom, that these are giveaways across the system. If you look at universal credit, that, again, we've got so many people who are not going to be helped by the new money that's going in. And the Resolution Foundation today just gave us the numbers. The bottom 10% that will be £30 better off after this budget. The top 10% will be over £500 better off. That is not the way you should be distributing the small amount of money that you got.
Well, the Prime Minister this morning has just been speaking about that. She's at a summit in Scandinavia, and this is what she had to say about the end to austerity from her point of view.
Austerity coming to an end isn't just about more money into our public services, it's about more money in people's pockets as well. Yesterday, we confirmed that announcement that we had made in the summer of giving the biggest single injection of extra money into our National Health Service in its history. When we first said it in the summer, we suggested we might have to raise taxes. We would have to raise taxes to fund part of that. What was clear in the budget yesterday is we fully funded that National Health Service, extra money into our NHS, and not raising taxes. Indeed, we have cut taxes for 32 million people. So the message of yesterday's budget is that the hard work of the British people has paid off.
Well, that's Mrs May speaking this morning. Stuart Hosey, what she said is true, isn't it? I mean, there is a lot of money going back into people's pockets.
Well, there is money going back into people's pockets. I think the whole point about that is, where does it go? And we're seeing substantial tax cuts for the better off, very modest tax cuts for those on more modest incomes. But for those who are not working or dependent on benefit, in work or out of work, the money he announced for universal credit, while welcome, barely digs into the cuts they've already had. And as a matter of fairness, as well as the technical point about 30 million people maybe getting a little back.
I'm not sure I would agree with that characterisation of the universal credit stuff. I mean, if you look at what he's done, he has raised the thresholds for universal credit. And if you talk to people at, for example, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they will say that's the single biggest thing you can do to get more people out of in-work poverty and to help people on the lowest paid. So it's a very material change, and it helps an awful lot of people who are most in need. Now, it's not the only thing in the budget, but it is really important, and it does an awful lot for the people in that bracket.
Let's be clear that the Chancellor has only replaced some of the money that George Osborne, the previous Chancellor, raided from that budget for universal credit in the first place. And John, you said earlier on about, we've all still got to tighten our belts and keep working towards getting a balanced economy. But most of that belt tightening is being done by the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. And actually, it's the working poor that have paid a huge price. And universal credit is a really damning indictment of this government's priorities and who has had to pay the price for the political choice of austerity. And I'm afraid whatever was announced yesterday for my constituents who've been forced into destitution as a result of the universal credit policy, it doesn't go anywhere near far enough.
I just point you at the graphs in the budget publications, which show that the people who have paid most since 2010 have been the top 10%.
Yeah, John McDonnell says he backs the tax cuts that have come in. He said he endorsed them this morning.
Well, we've supported the tax changes on personal allowance because that's taken more people out of tax. I do think there's a debate to be had personally about whether we continue to support those additional tax changes, because so much of the benefit goes to the richest in our society. And I certainly think it's unconscionable to bring them forward for 1 year whilst continuing with the benefits freeze, which continues to squeeze my constituents. So I think there's got to be a more active debate and discussion about who's really paying the price.
What about Liberal Democrats? Do you support the tax threshold changes?
I wouldn't have brought forward the higher rate one, because indeed that could have gone to end the benefits freeze, which would have had a real impact for people who are absolutely struggling and up against it. And I would have considered, I wouldn't have, put such a virtue on not raising any taxes. Could have raised corporation tax back up to, say, 20%. You'd have had 7 to 8 billion more to play with, and then you could have done something about policing, for goodness sake, our prison system, our schools. I mean, the Chancellor was honest, his money for schools is just for bits and bobs. But they actually need are teachers. You could have done that, and it wouldn't have damaged the economy.
The SNP support the changes in tax thresholds?
The basic rate threshold, I think, is very sensible, raising it. As for the higher rate threshold, what the Scottish Government do will be announced in their budget. But I think there's, as I say, and as Susan's just said, an argument about fairness. Do you want to give away the biggest amount of money to those who are earning the most, or do you want to deploy that money more carefully in a more targeted way for those who need it most? And that's the debate I think will be happening in the Scottish Parliament for the next few months. His
supporters are saying that Philip Hammonds is one thing that was brave in this budget, which is start taking on the tech giants with a digital tax. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I mean, we're seeing an unfairness here because we've got digital tech companies operating in a tax code designed for the 1950s. And so the kind of bricks and mortar department stores with the big overheads, even if they've got an online offering, simply can't compete. And I think he's right to take that challenge on.
Can I just come in there? Because I think that's absolutely right. It's not just the tax code which is operating in a sort of horse and cart era. It's also the competition laws and everything else as well. This is an important first step, but we have got to upgrade our entire way of doing business to cope with digital businesses.
400 million he's talking about is about 1%
He is right to say that what you need is an international consensus here, because actually these giants operate globally. As a starting point to make sure that we're getting the ball rolling, this is absolutely essential, but we can't stop here. There's a whole series of things about our competition laws which need to make sure that they're fair to consumers.
I think you're finding unanimous support around this issue. It's one of these things that cuts across all of us have just been, I think, irate.
But I think in terms of start point, yes, it's all very welcome. We all agree with that. But we've got to show more ambition, because it's not as if the issues of digital businesses versus brick-based businesses are new. It's not as if we don't understand how business rates affect our high street. And it's not as if we haven't been talking about this, certainly for the whole time I've been in politics since 2010. So I think that we can and should show more ambition. And we should also look at the broader piece of tax avoidance. We should relook at the diverted profits.
Well, he also said he was going to get more money back on tax avoidance as well.
Yes, exactly. Well, every Every Chancellor says
Well, and
that,
he
and I
has,
think
to
if
be
you look
fair.
over the last 8 years,
And he
actually
has.
he's missed most of his targets of what he thought he was going to get compared
Quite
to
a lot more.
what he did actually get. But you need a broader approach that's got to look at our tax havens issues around our crown dependencies and overseas territories. So I think it's good as far as it goes, but it could go a hell of a lot
Now,
further.
what about the personality of this Chancellor? I mean, does his personality matter? Do you feel more comfortable with him than with George Osborne?
Are you saying you didn't like his jokes?
No, actually, you're appropriate enough. I was going to Lou when he made his jokes about Brexit.
No, I mean, Philip Hammonds is a fiscal conservative, and I think it's really important that we don't open the taps too far and start to overspend and put the economy long-term at risk, particularly because, and here I would agree with Stuart, if you've got Brexit on the horizon, you have got to keep some powder dry. You've got to be careful because we don't yet know what kind of a deal we're going to get. We're going to need to have some play in the system so that, depending on the kind of deal, we can adjust as we need to. And if you haven't got that, if you haven't been careful now, then you are really up against the buffers.
What do you think of Susan?
Well, the play in the
Susan
system
Kramer?
is a £15 billion reserve,
Yeah.
so that would
Very
have
sensibly.
dwarfed anything that basically that he did. So I don't argue that he needs it. The sad thing is that we're going into a situation where he is going to need it. As I say, those underlying growth figures are awful.
Yeah.
Nobody keeps talking about them, and they get worse under every single Brexit
But you see,
scenario.
Stuart Hosey, you were saying we have to see this all in the context of Brexit. And yesterday, given the arguments within the Conservative Party, he made quite a strong appeal to say, look, we've just got to end up with a deal which might leave us quite close to the European Union.
Of course we've got to end up with a deal that leaves us very close to the European Union. Otherwise, the economic impact on a kind of mid-range
in that
basis
sense, he's
is
your
5%.
ally, isn't he?
Well, you know, we all want to see the best possible deal, but just on the numbers, and Susan's point about growth, he's still borrowing 20 to 30 billion a year for the entire forecast period. Although debt falls as a share of GDP, it still goes up to around £1.9 trillion. It wouldn't take much of a shock or a bad Brexit deal to tip us into a very bad place indeed. And I think that's why the headroom's important, but whether he's got enough, well, that's another question entirely.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.